August, 480 BCE, the Hot Gates. A Persian king sits on a golden throne overlooking a narrow coastal pass, watching his army, the largest the ancient world has ever seen, slam into a wall of bronze and flesh, and lose again. Herodotus tells us Xerxes leapt from his seat 3 times that day, stunned that Greeks, any Greeks, would stand against him rather than kneel. This is the story of how a few thousand men in a strip of land barely wider than a modern road made the King of Kings doubt everything he knew about war. But before we get to the blood and bronze, you need to understand something. Something the movies never tell you. This wasn't supposed to be a last stand. Rewind a few weeks. Xerxes is coming. Everyone knows it. The great king of Persia has spent 4 years preparing the largest military operation the ancient world has ever witnessed. He's built bridges across the Hellespont, literally lashing boats together to walk his army from Asia into Europe. He's dug a canal through a peninsula so his fleet won't have to risk the dangerous waters that wrecked his father's ships a decade earlier. This isn't an invasion. It's a statement, a demonstration of what happens when you defy the Persian Empire, and the target? Greece. Specifically, Athens, the city that had the audacity to help Greek colonists rebel against Persian rule, the city that humiliated Persia at Marathon 10 years before. Xerxes isn't just here to conquer, he's here to erase the insult. Now, how many men did he bring? Here's where it gets wild. Ancient sources, Herodotus chief among them, claim Xerxes marched with over 2 million soldiers. Modern historians laugh at this number. Feeding 2 million men? Impossible. Moving them? A logistical nightmare that would stretch across continents. The real number was probably somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000 fighting men, plus sailors, plus support personnel, plus the endless baggage train of an empire on the move. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter if it was 200,000 or 2 million. Against the Greeks, it was overwhelming, unprecedented, terrifying. The Greek city-states, famous for fighting each other more than anyone else, suddenly faced a simple choice: submit or be destroyed. Most of northern Greece? They submitted, took the easy path, gave Xerxes earth and water, the Persian symbols of surrender. But not everyone. Athens refused, Sparta refused, and slowly, impossibly, a coalition began to form. But here's the problem. They weren't ready. The Greeks needed time to gather forces, time for Sparta to finish its religious festival and march in full strength, time for the fleet to assemble, time to figure out where, exactly, they could make a stand against a force that outnumbered them by a factor of 10, maybe 20. They needed a place where numbers wouldn't matter. They needed a choke point. Enter Thermopylae. The name means hot gates, named for the thermal springs that bubbled up near the pass, and in 480 BCE, it was one of the narrowest passages in all of Greece. Picture this. Mountains rising sharply on your left, the sea pressing close on your right. And between them? A corridor of land so tight that in some places a single wagon could barely squeeze through. Now, here's something crucial, something that changes everything about how you imagine this battle. If you visit Thermopylae today, you'll see a wide coastal plain. The sea is miles away from the ancient battlefield. You might stand there and think, this doesn't look so narrow. How did anyone hold this? But you're not seeing what Leonidas saw. 25 centuries of sedimentation have pushed the shoreline out. Rivers deposited silt. The land grew. What's now open farmland was, in 480 BCE, underwater. The pass that the Greeks defended? It was tighter than a modern 2-lane road in places. At the narrowest points, maybe 50 feet of usable ground between cliff and water. 50 feet, that's it, that's the doorway to Greece. And the Greeks decided to slam it shut. But Thermopylae wasn't the only door. This is the part most people miss. The part that transforms this from a romantic suicide mission into actual military strategy. While the army held the hot gates on land, the Greek navy had to hold the sea at a nearby strait called Artemisium. Think of it like a lock with two bolts. Both have to hold, or the whole thing fails. If the Persian fleet breaks through at Artemisium, they can land troops behind the army at Thermopylae. The defenders get surrounded and slaughtered, not in glorious battle, but in pointless encirclement. If the army breaks at Thermopylae, the fleet at Artemisium is exposed. Persian ground forces pour south, and the ships have nowhere safe to retreat. Two fronts, one strategy. Both must hold. This was coordinated defense at its finest. This was Greek generals actually working together, which, if you know anything about Greek history, was practically a miracle in itself. So, when Leonidas marched north with his men, he wasn't marching to die. He was marching to buy time. Time for the fleet to contest the sea. Time for the rest of Greece to mobilize. Time to prove that Persia could be resisted. The plan was simple. Hold the pass, bleed the Persians, and withdraw when the position became untenable. It was a good plan. It almost worked. Now let's talk about the men who marched into that narrow strip of hell. You've heard of the 300. Everyone has. Thanks to Hollywood, thanks to Frank Miller, thanks to centuries of legend building, the number has become mythic. Sacred, almost. 300 Spartans against 1,000,000 Persians. It's a great story. It's also incomplete, because here's what the movies skip. Leonidas didn't march to Thermopylae with 300 men. He marched with nearly 7,000. Let that satisfying sit for a moment. 7,000 Greeks from across the fractured, squabbling collection of city-states that couldn't agree on anything. Except, apparently, that Xerxes needed to be stopped. The Spartans brought their 300, yes. But marching alongside them? Soldiers from Thespiae, from Thebes, from Corinth, Arcadia, Phocis, and a dozen other places whose names have faded from popular memory. These weren't extras. They weren't background characters in someone else's story. They were the reason the defense worked at all. Think about it. Picture that narrow pass. Picture wave after wave of Persian soldiers crashing against a Greek shield wall. Now picture doing that for hours, for days. No matter how elite you are, no matter how legendary your training, human beings get tired. Arms go numb from holding shields. Legs buckle. Spears grow heavy. The adrenaline that kept you fighting in the first hour becomes poison in your muscles by the fifth. 300 men, no matter how superhuman, cannot hold a pass against an army for multiple days of continuous assault. But 300 men rotating with thousands of allies? That changes everything. Fresh units cycling to the front. Exhausted warriors pulling back to rest, drink water, bind wounds. A constant rotation that kept the defensive line sharp while the Persians threw body after body into the grinder. The Allies weren't just present, they were essential. So why do we only remember the 300? Because Sparta was different, and everyone knew it. In an age when most Greek soldiers were part-time warriors, farmers and craftsmen who picked up spears when their city called, Spartans were something else entirely. They were professionals. Full-time, lifelong, obsessively trained killing machines. From age 7, Spartan boys entered the Agage, a brutal state-run training program designed to forge soldiers. They learned to fight, to endure pain, to survive on almost nothing. They were beaten, starved, forced to steal food, and punished not for stealing but for getting caught. By the time a Spartan male became a full citizen, a Spartiate, he had been training for war longer than most people had been alive. And these weren't just any Spartiates. Herodotus tells us that Leonidas specifically chose men who had living sons, men whose family lines would continue if they fell. He knew. Even at the start, some part of him knew this might become a one-way trip. But the Spartans weren't just physically dominant. They were psychologically terrifying. There's a famous story, maybe true, maybe legend, but it captures something real. Before the battle, a local Greek warned the Spartans about Persian archers. "Their arrows are so numerous," he said, "that they block out the sun." A Spartan named Dienekes reportedly replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." That's not just bravado, that's a mindset, an almost supernatural calm in the face of annihilation. And the other Greeks saw it. The Thespians, the Thebans, the Phocians. They watched these red-cloaked warriors prepare for battle like they were getting ready for a morning workout, oiling their bodies, combing their long hair, stretching, combing their hair. Xerxes sent a scout to observe the Greek camp, and the scout returned bewildered. "They're grooming themselves," he reported, "like they're preparing for a festival, not a battle." When Xerxes asked a Greek exile what this meant, the exile, a former Spartan king named Demaratus, gave him an answer that should have made him turn his army around. "These men have come to fight for the pass, and that is what they intend to do. It is the custom of Spartans to dress their hair when they are about to risk their lives." They weren't scared. They weren't desperate. They were ready. And that readiness was contagious. Because here's the thing about elite units. Their value isn't just in how they fight. It's in what their presence signals to everyone else. When the 300 Spartans marched to Thermopylae, they sent a message to all of Greece. This matters. This is real. We are committing our best. Sparta could have sent nobody, could have hidden behind their walls and waited to see what happened. Other city-states would have understood. After all, the Spartans were in the middle of a sacred religious festival. They had an excuse. Instead, Leonidas took 300 of his finest warriors and marched north. That decision changed everything. Suddenly, the small contingents from smaller cities didn't feel so alone. The Thespians, who brought 700 men, proportionally a massive commitment for their tiny city, knew they were standing beside legends. The wavering cities, the ones still deciding whether to resist or submit, saw Spartan cloaks on the front line and thought, maybe we can do this. Maybe resistance isn't suicide. The 300 were the anchor, the psychological center of gravity, the proof that Greece was serious. And they would need every ounce of that psychological weight. Because on the other side of the pass, Xerxes was getting impatient. He had camped his massive army in the plains north of Thermopylae, fully expecting the Greeks to take one look at his forces and scatter. That's what sensible people did when Persia came calling. That's what dozens of cities and nations had done before. But 4 days passed. 4 days of the Greeks just waiting, holding their position. Not running. Xerxes couldn't believe it. According to Herodotus, he sent a messenger to the Greek camp with a simple offer: surrender your weapons. Leonidas sent back a reply that has echoed through history. Come and take them. Molon Lab. 2 words. The most defiant 2 words ever spoken to an empire. The waiting was over. The assault would begin. And Xerxes was about to learn something that would shake him to his core. These Greeks in the pass weren't just brave, they were something he'd never encountered. They were immovable. The first wave came on the 5th day. Xerxes had waited long enough. 4 days of watching these stubborn Greeks squat in his path, refusing to bow, refusing to break, refusing to behave like conquered peoples were supposed to behave. Enough. He sent the Medes first, solid troops, experienced fighters from the heart of his empire, thousands of them pouring into that narrow corridor, certain that numbers and fury would sweep these Greeks aside in hours. They were wrong. Picture the scene. The pass narrows. Persian soldiers, packed tight by the geography they can't control, funnel toward the Greek position. They can't spread out, can't flank, can't use their cavalry, can't bring their archers to bear effectively without hitting their own men. All they can do is march forward into the teeth of the phalanx, and the phalanx is waiting. If you've never seen a Greek phalanx in action, let me paint it for you. Rows of heavily armored men, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. Each warrior carries a massive bronze-covered shield called an aspis, 3 feet across, heavy as sin, designed not just for defense but as a weapon in itself. In their right hands, 8-foot spears called doru. Behind the front rank, more spears bristling forward like the quills of some monstrous hedgehog. And that front rank? Encased in bronze, helmet, breastplate, greaves on the shins. These men were walking tanks in an age of flesh and iron. The Persians had numbers. They had courage. They had the weight of empire behind them. But when they crashed into that wall of bronze and ash wood spears, they died. The killing was mechanical, almost industrial. Persian soldiers, many armed with shorter spears and lighter armor, couldn't reach the Greeks. The doru outranged their weapons by feet. Doesn't sound like much until you realize that in close combat, 2 feet of reach is the difference between killing and dying. They pushed forward. The Greeks pushed back. Shields slammed into bodies. Spears punched through wicker shields, through leather armor, through flesh. And when the spears broke, and they broke constantly, shattering against shields and bone, the Greeks drew short swords and went to work at close range. Men died in that pass by the hundreds, by the thousands. The Medes fell back. Xerxes sent more. But it wasn't just Greek equipment that broke the Persian assault. It was something more subtle, more devastating. Discipline. At some point during the fighting, the Greeks did something that must have seemed like madness to the Persians watching. They turned and ran. The whole line, breaking, scattering, fleeing back down the pass in apparent panic. The Persians surged forward, scenting victory. Finally, the Greeks were human after all. Chase them down, finish them. And then the Greeks stopped, turned, reformed their line in seconds, and slaughtered every Persian who had broken formation to pursue. It was a feigned retreat, a tactical trick that required incredible coordination, iron discipline, and absolute trust in the men beside you. One soldier panics for real, one unit breaks too slowly to reform, and the whole thing collapses into actual rout. The Greeks pulled it off. Again and again, the Persians kept falling for it. What choice did they have? In that narrow pass, with officers screaming at them to advance, with the press of bodies behind them making retreat impossible, they had to push forward into the grinder. Herodotus gives us an image that captures Xerxes' disbelief. The King of Kings sat on his golden throne, positioned on a hill overlooking the pass so he could watch his army's inevitable triumph. Attendants surrounded him. Scribes recorded the names of soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle. Instead, Xerxes watched his men fail. 3 times, Herodotus says, the king leapt from his throne in horror. 3 times he watched elite Persian units march into that corridor of death and get hurled back, leaving carpets of corpses behind. This wasn't supposed to happen. This defied everything Xerxes understood about warfare, about empire, about the natural order of the world. Persia had conquered Babylon, Egypt, the vast steppes of Central Asia, nations with armies, with walls, with centuries of military tradition, all had bent the knee. And now a few thousand Greeks in a mountain pass were making his immortal empire look mortal? Unthinkable, unacceptable, impossible. But it was happening. The Medes were finished, broken. Xerxes pulled them back and summoned his finest troops, the Immortals. 10,000 of Persia's most elite soldiers, so named because their ranks were always kept at exactly 10,000. When one fell, another immediately took his place, making the unit seem undying. They were the pride of the empire. The soldiers other soldiers feared. Surely they would succeed where the Medes had failed. They didn't. The same geography that neutered Persian numbers neutered Persian quality. It didn't matter that the immortals were elite. In that choke point, they could only engage the Greeks a few ranks at a time. Their numerical advantage meant nothing. Their skills were wasted, pushing through the wreckage of failed assaults. They attacked, they died, they fell back. Day 1 ended with the pass still in Greek hands. Day 2 was worse. Xerxes threw everything he had at the position, every unit, every nationality in his diverse empire. Kissians, Egyptians, more immortals. All of them walked into that narrow hell. All of them walked into the grinding, mechanical death of the phalanx. The Greeks, meanwhile, rotated their forces. Spartans held the line, then pulled back. Thespians moved forward, then Thebans. Fresh shields, fresh arms, fresh spears, while the Persians had to keep feeding exhausted, demoralized troops into the same killing ground. And through it all, the Greeks didn't just defend, they attacked. At one point, the Spartans advanced out of the narrowest section of the pass, pushing into a wider area where more Persians could engage them. Insanity, you might think. Why give up your advantage? But the Spartans weren't giving up anything. They were demonstrating something. Even in open ground, they were better, faster, more lethal. They carved through Persian ranks, then withdrew to the narrow point before they could be surrounded. It was a message. We're not trapped in here with you. You're trapped in here with us. By the end of day 2, Persian morale was shattered. Xerxes had lost thousands of men. Thousands. Against a force a fraction of his size. His timetable for conquering Greece was in ruins. His army, supposedly invincible, had been exposed as vulnerable. And every hour that passed, every failed assault, every heap of Persian dead, it sent a message rippling across Greece. They can be stopped. They can be hurt. They can bleed. The Greeks at Thermopylae weren't just killing soldiers. They were killing certainty, killing the myth of Persian invincibility. Xerxes needed a solution, fast. And that solution would come not from superior tactics or overwhelming force. It would come from betrayal. His name was Ephialtes, a local Greek. A man who knew these mountains like he knew his own heartbeat. A man who saw the Persian army, saw the gold they carried, and made a calculation. History doesn't record exactly what Xerxes paid him, but whatever it was, Ephialtes sold his countrymen for it. He told Xerxes about the path, the Anopaia path. A goat track, really. A narrow, treacherous trail that wound through the mountains behind the Greek position. Locals used it. Shepherds, hunters, people who knew where to place their feet in the dark. An army? An army had never used it. The Greeks knew it existed. They weren't fools. Leonidas had posted 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the heights, specifically to guard against this possibility. But the Phocians were watching for a frontal approach. They expected any flanking force to come at them directly, to fight for the path. They didn't expect what came instead. Night fell on the second day of battle. The Greeks, exhausted but unbroken, settled into what rest they could manage. They had held. Against everything Xerxes had thrown at them, they had held. But in the darkness, something was moving. Xerxes had given the immortals a new mission. Not another suicidal frontal assault. Even the King of Kings learned eventually. Instead, they would follow Ephialtes up the mountain path, move through the night, and emerge behind the Greek position at dawn. 10,000 elite soldiers, guided by a traitor, walking single file through mountain darkness toward the exposed Greek rear. The trap was closing. The Phocians heard them first. In the pre-dawn darkness, the sound of thousands of feet crunching through oak leaves carried through the still mountain air. The Phocians scrambled to arms, formed up, prepared to fight. But the immortals didn't stop to engage. They didn't need to. They showered the Phocians with arrows, pinned them down, and simply marched past. They weren't here to fight Greeks on a mountainside. They were here to get behind the pass, and now, nothing stood in their way. Word reached Leonidas before dawn. The Greeks still held the pass. The frontal assault had been stopped cold. But now? Now the immortals were in the mountains above them, moving to cut off their retreat. In hours, maybe less, the Persian force would emerge behind Greek lines. The position was lost. Not because the Greeks had failed, not because they'd been defeated in combat, but because one man, for a handful of gold, had shown the enemy the back door. This is the moment the battle changes. This is where the stand becomes the last stand. And this is where Leonidas made his choice. He dismissed the army, most of it anyway. The bulk of the Greek force, the Corinthians, the Arcadians, most of the allies, Leonidas ordered them to withdraw, march south, live to fight another day. Some historians say he dismissed them, others say he permitted them to leave. Herodotus suggests there was argument, tension, some Greeks wanting to stay and die beside the Spartans. But in the end, most went. The strategic logic was sound. These men were the core of Greek resistance. If they died here, uselessly, in an untenable position, who would defend the cities to the south? Who would fight at the next pass, the next battle, the next desperate stand? Thermopylae was lost. Greece wasn't, not yet. So the Allied army retreated, carrying with them everything they'd learned about Persian tactics, Persian weaknesses, Persian mortality. And behind them, in the pass, the 300 stayed. But not just the 300, this is crucial. This is the part that gets lost in the legend, that fades behind the crimson cloaks and the Spartan mystique. The Thespians refused to leave. 700 men from a tiny city-state, a place most people today couldn't find on a map. They had marched to Thermopylae as part of the coalition, had fought for 2 days beside Spartans and Thebans and Phocians. And when Leonidas told them they could go, they said no. Their general, Demophilus, kept his men in line. Not because Sparta ordered it, not because they had to, but because leaving would have felt like abandonment, like betrayal of everything they'd fought for. The Thespians stayed to die, voluntarily, without songs being sung about them for 2,000 years. There were Thebans, too, about 400 of them. Their story is more complicated. Herodotus suggests some were kept as hostages, insurance that Thebes wouldn't defect to Persia. Others may have stayed willingly. History isn't clear, and the Thebans' reputation suffered after some of their countrymen eventually surrendered. But in those final hours, they were there, in the pass, waiting for the end. So count them up: 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, a few hundred others, perhaps, helots, servants, men whose names were never recorded. Somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 Greeks chose to remain, against 10,000 immortals coming from behind, against the entire Persian army still pressing from the front. No retreat, no reinforcement, no hope of victory, just a narrow strip of ground, a wall of shields, and a decision to make the enemy pay for every inch. Why did they stay? For the Spartans, part of it was law. Spartan soldiers didn't retreat. The stories of mothers telling sons to come back with your shield or on it, those weren't poetry. That was culture. A Spartan who fled battle faced worse than death. He faced disgrace. His family faced disgrace. Everything that made life worth living would be stripped away. But it was more than that. Someone had to hold the pass while the army retreated. Someone had to buy time, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it took for the Allied force to get clear. A rearguard action, military strategists call it. The men who stay behind so others can escape. And beyond strategy, beyond duty, there was something else. A message. Xerxes had expected the Greeks to kneel. He had expected submission, the normal response of small nations facing overwhelming force. Instead, he would get this. Greeks who chose death over surrender, who fought to the last breath not because they could win, but because fighting was what they were. The message wasn't for Xerxes alone. It was for all of Greece, for every city still deciding whether to resist or submit, for generations not yet born. This is what we are. This is what Greeks do. Dawn broke on the third day. The Persians knew the path had worked. The immortals were in position. The trap was set. And in the pass, Leonidas and his remaining men prepared for what was coming. Herodotus tells us the Greeks knew they were going to die, knew it with absolute certainty. And knowing this, they made a choice that still defies explanation. They attacked. They didn't wait for death. They went to meet it. As dawnlight spilled into the pass, Leonidas led his men forward, not to the narrow choke point they'd defended for 2 days, but beyond it, into the wider part of the pass, into the open ground where Persian numbers could finally matter. It was suicide. They knew it was suicide. They did it anyway. Why? Maybe they wanted to take as many Persians with them as possible. The wider ground meant more enemies to kill before the end. Maybe they wanted to buy every possible minute for the retreating army. Maybe, after 2 days of grinding defensive warfare, they simply wanted to attack, to feel the savage joy of offense one last time. Or maybe they understood something about the power of symbols. A defensive last stand is heroic. But a final charge? An attack against impossible odds when death is certain? That's something else entirely. That's the kind of story that echoes through centuries. The Greeks burst from the pass like men possessed. Herodotus describes what followed as a slaughter, but not one-sided. Not at first. The Greeks crashed into the Persian front lines with a fury that shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Spears shattered. The Spartans and Thespians drew swords and waded into the mass of enemy soldiers, killing with an efficiency born of lifetime training and absolute commitment. Persian officers fell. Commanders. Nobles. Men whose deaths would be felt in the royal court. The Greeks didn't fight like men trying to survive. They fought like men already dead, with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. According to Herodotus, 2 of Xerxes' own brothers died in the melee. Royal blood, spilled in the dirt of a Greek mountain pass by men who should have been crushed days ago. But numbers tell in the end. They always do. Spears broke, swords dulled against bone and bronze. One by one, the Greeks fell. Leonidas went down somewhere in the chaos. The king of Sparta, dead in the dirt like any common soldier. The Persians tried to claim his body, a trophy for Xerxes, proof that the defiant Greek commander had been destroyed. The Greeks wouldn't allow it. 4 times, Herodotus tells us, the Greeks drove the Persians back from Leonidas's corpse. 4 times they formed a ring of shields around their fallen king and fought off every attempt to take him. 4 times. With their numbers dwindling, with enemies pressing from every side, with death certain and imminent. They would not let the Persians have him. By now, the immortals had completed their march. They emerged from the mountain path behind the Greek position, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Not that retreat was ever the plan. The surviving Greeks, how many were left? A few hundred? Less? Pulled back to a small hill near the wall they'd defended for so long. A tiny rise of ground in that narrow pass. They formed up one last time. And the Persians, tired of losing men in close combat, did what they should have done from the beginning. They stood back, raised their bows, and let fly. The final moments were arrows, wave after wave of Persian shafts darkening the sky, falling on that small cluster of Greeks who had no cover, no escape, no protection except shields already battered from 3 days of combat. The Greeks who still had spears threw them. The Greeks who still had swords stood ready to use them if any Persian came close. Herodotus claims that by the end, some fought with bare hands, with teeth, with whatever they could use to kill one more enemy before they died. It's probably exaggeration. The poetry of historians writing decades later, trying to capture something that transcended normal battle. But maybe not. Maybe men facing certain death, men who had chosen to stay when they could have fled, fought exactly like that. Like animals, like demons, like legends. When it was over, the pass was silent. The Greeks were dead. Every single one who had stayed. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, the Thebans, some dead, some surrendered, their story complicated and controversial for generations. Xerxes walked among the bodies, the King of Kings, finally victorious, surveying the men who had defied him. What he did next tells you everything about what those 3 days had cost him. He found Leonidas's body, and in a rage that defied all Persian custom, all tradition of honoring fallen enemies, he ordered the Spartan king's head cut off, mounted on a stake. This wasn't normal. Persian kings didn't desecrate the dead. Even enemies were treated with dignity in defeat. But Leonidas had wounded something deeper than Persian flesh. He had wounded Persian pride, Persian certainty, the unshakable belief that the empire was unstoppable. Xerxes wanted that body destroyed because even in death, it frightened him. The pass fell. Xerxes marched south. Weeks later, he would burn Athens itself. The city evacuated. Its people fled to the ships. By any military measure, Thermopylae was a defeat. The Greeks lost the position, lost their king, lost over 1,000 men. But here's what Xerxes didn't understand. What he couldn't understand. He hadn't won anything that mattered. The delay at Thermopylae, 3 days of battle, 4 days of waiting before that, gave the Greek fleet time to contest the Persians at Artemisium. The naval battle was inconclusive, but the Greek ships withdrew intact, ready to fight again. Weeks after Thermopylae, those ships would meet the Persian fleet at Salamis. In narrow straits where Persian numbers meant nothing, sound familiar? The Greeks would destroy Xerxes' navy, break his supply lines, force him to retreat with half his army. A year later, at Plataea, the Greeks would crush the Persian army he left behind. The invasion would fail. Persia would never conquer Greece. And it all started in a mountain pass where a few thousand men refused to kneel. After the war, the Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae, a stone lion for Leonidas, whose name meant lion-like, and an inscription that has survived in various forms for 2,500 years. The original Greek, composed by the poet Simonides, translates roughly, "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." No boasting, no claims of glory, just a simple statement. We did what we were supposed to do. We followed the code. We stayed. So what did Thermopylae actually achieve? Time. It bought time for Greece to prepare. Blood. It cost Persia thousands of elite soldiers. But more than that, more than any tactical calculation, it bought belief. Before Thermopylae, Persian victory seemed inevitable. The empire was too large, too powerful, too experienced. Resistance seemed not just futile but foolish. After Thermopylae, everything changed. The Greeks had proof. Proof that Persians could be killed, that Persian offensives could be stopped, that a small force in the right position, with enough courage, could make an empire bleed. The fence-sitters chose sides. The waverers found resolve. The fractured, squabbling Greeks became something they had never been before: united. Xerxes expected submission. He expected the natural order of things, small nations bowing before great ones. Instead, he got a message, written in blood on the stones of the hot gates. This war will cost you more than you planned. The 300 became legend. But they didn't fight alone. 7,000 Greeks held that pass at the start. 1,000 chose to stay at the end. Thespians, Thebans, names forgotten by everyone except historians. They deserve to be remembered too. Because Thermopylae wasn't about Spartan exceptionalism. It was about what happens when ordinary people decide that some things matter more than survival. When they plant their feet and say, "No further," Xerxes won the battle. But standing over the corpses of men who had chosen death over submission, watching his army limp south with a shattered timetable and shattered confidence, he must have known something had gone wrong. He must have felt it, that creeping doubt. These people don't break the way others do. This war might cost me everything. 2,500 years later, we're still telling the story. That's the real victory. Not the pass held, not the days bought, not even the inspiration kindled. The real victory is this: Xerxes is remembered as the king who couldn't conquer Greece, and Leonidas is remembered as the man who showed him why.